You're listening to Admitting Diagnosis, the Journal Watch podcast for the week ending October 3rd. I'm Joe Elia. We try to corral the week's essential medical news, the story you'd want your own clinician to know about, and then we offer an interview, sometimes with a news slant and sometimes not. In this week's interview, the topic is news, how stories about drug research get covered in the news media. Dr. Michael Hochman is our guest, and we ask him about his study published in this week's JAMA. If you'd like to leave us a comment, don't be shy. Call 617-440-4374. Links for everything we discuss are available at podcasts.jwatch.org. All right, here are the week's medical headlines. Actually, there's only one. Screen your coronary patients for depression. Here are the details. The American Heart Association this week issued a scientific advisory in the journal Circulation. The authors recommend routine screening of patients with coronary heart disease in the physician's office as well as in the hospital and during cardiac rehab. Those who screen positive for depression should be referred out for treatment. The authors note that depression is about twice as prevalent among patients with coronary disease as among the rest of the population, and that depression is associated with lower survival in coronary disease. The article, which is free, includes a screening questionnaire. Check it out. And here is the Journal Watch interview. JAMA carries an article in this week's issue about how the news media cover drug research. It turns out that about half the news reports don't reveal when a drug company has paid for the research. Plus, the JAMA authors note a tendency for journalists to use brand names when reporting on drug research. When the JAMA authors asked the editors of major news outlets whether their stories discussed company sponsorship or emphasized generic drug names, their answers were mostly at odds with their practices. Dr. Michael Hochman, the first author listed on the JAMA paper, has kindly offered to chat with us today. Mike is a third-year resident in internal medicine with the Cambridge Health Alliance and Harvard Medical School. Welcome, Mike. Thanks for talking with us.
Thank you.
Why did you undertake this research?
Well, I had two main motives. The first is that as a doctor, I've become increasingly worried in recent years that company-funded research simply can't be trusted in the same way that non-company funded research can. And I think there are a series of recent developments that highlight this point. The most widely known is the so-called rofecoxib scandal, which is unfortunately better known by its brand name, the Vioxx
yes,
scandal.
I noticed you used the generic name right away.
Yes, trying to drive that point home as much as possible.
Yes.
And there have also been a number of other recent studies showing that company-funded research is more likely to show favorable results, and also a publication bias in which positive studies are more likely to be submitted for publication by companies than negative studies. And because of these developments, when I make decisions about my patients, I try to think very carefully about the motives of the researchers involved and why they did the study. And I think it's important that not only doctors do this, but also patients and readers of news organizations. And for this reason, I think it's very important that news articles highlight when a study has been funded by a pharmaceutical company, and I had noticed that they don't seem to do a very good job of that. The second motive I had for doing this research is that I think all of us, doctors, patients, and the news media, have gotten into what I would consider to be a bad habit of referring to medications by their proprietary brand names. Now, at a philosophical level, I think it's preferable to use a generic name because we want to remove research as much as possible from the commercial context, and when you use a brand name, it inherently commercializes the research. But in addition, as we all know, medications come in multiple different brands, and this can be confusing for patients, and the use of generic names can certainly simplify things. And then finally, I think many of us in the medical community would agree that we have a real problem in this country of using expensive brand name medications when equally effective, better studied, and perhaps even better generics also could be used. And I think when journalists use brand names, it inadvertently does promote the use of brand name drugs.
Do your patients come to you with questions about some of these drugs and some of these news reports, and do you hear them using those brand names that you try to avoid?
All practicing clinicians have had patients come to them, and they've either read about a brand name medication on an advertisement or read about it in a newspaper, and they come in specifically requesting that medication. And for the reasons I discussed, it's not necessarily clear that these new drugs are preferable compared to generic alternatives, and may even be riskier since they haven't been as well studied. And I think if the news media did use generic medication names more frequently, this wouldn't happen as much, and there wouldn't be this tendency as much to prescribe the newest brand name medication.
Well, don't you think that clinicians can, when prescribing something, when a patient comes in and wants Diet Pepsi, say, and the clinician says, oh, I know a generic equivalent for Diet Pepsi will give you, Royal Crown Cola or something like that. Do you think that clinicians are just not prepared to make those translations, or do you think that the whole system has been corrupted by this sort of bombardment with proprietary names?
Well, I think you're right in that the ultimate responsibility does rest with the clinician, who is the one who writes the prescription and perhaps is influenced inappropriately by pharmaceutical advertising to use expensive brand name medications unnecessarily and inappropriately. With that said, the job of clinicians is hard enough as it is, and I think a lot of primary care doctors and specialists would agree with me on that. And anything we can do to sort of promote the public good and make patients come to us with the right questions and not ask for medications that haven't been proven to be better than generics and are more expensive makes our jobs easier and ultimately will result in better medical decision making.
Well, those proprietary names certainly reflect the mind share that all that advertising that the drug companies do has been able to buy. And I guess we might just say that it's the mind share that we're up against when we're trying to have dispassionate conversations about one drug or another, or one class of drug or another. But one of the things that was more interesting was the fact that the financial disclosures of some of these articles were incomplete, that there was a tendency not to report on the fact that one bit of research or another has been paid for by a drug company with a very strong financial interest in the outcome. To that end, what do you think that journalists should do?
Well, I think the most straightforward action that journalists should take is to report when a study has been funded by a pharmaceutical company and to include this information very prominently in the article, one of the first things that the readers read. Unfortunately, however, I don't think that is sufficient. I think readers need to have some appreciation for what this means when a study has been funded by a pharmaceutical company. And while they may have a sense of this from following the news and hearing about the rofecoxib or Vioxx scandal, I think the news media needs to do a better job of making this clear to patients and readers and what the implication of company funding is. And the Association of Healthcare Journalists has actually issued a series of principles that really encourage journalists to seek unbiased experts to really learn about the gory details of studies and really understand them so that they can really accurately report the positives and the negatives of the studies.
And so, if I were a journalist trying to let us say that your article, the one I'm interviewing you about this morning, was about a drug instead, and in that circumstance, I should make sure to reveal that you'd received some funding from one drug company or another, to make sure that I use the generic name of the drug when possible, and to have a kind of an inherent skepticism about the results. And so, if I were talking with you, who's a principal researcher, I should also be talking with someone else. That's your recommendation? Is that right?
I agree 100% with what you said. It's the increased skepticism with company-funded research and the need to have hear it from an unbiased source as well.
And in the development of new drugs, it's often difficult to find those unbiased sources, because if the drug is a new molecule, you're not going to find many people with experience with it. But I guess you might find people with experience in that class of drug or in some of the preliminary research. But I think you'd admit it's not easy to find people with expertise in the newest drugs available.
I agree with that completely. With that said, though, I think that there are a lot of epidemiologists and people who are experts in evaluating research critically, who may not be experts in a particular type of or class of medications, but may be an expert in research methods, and they can really see through some of the flaws with studies. And if you ask what are the sort of specific flaws that a lot of times come along with company-funded research, I think one obvious one is what endpoints we choose. So a lot of times if a pharmaceutical company has a cholesterol medication, they will do a study and prove that the medication lowers the cholesterol. But as a patient or a doctor, we don't really care whether or not the cholesterol is lowered. We care whether we're able to prevent a heart attack or somebody from dying.
Yes.
And I think when the companies design these studies, they trick us into thinking that a medication is good because they can achieve some surrogate endpoint, such as lowering their cholesterol, but not actually achieve a more important hard endpoint, such as preventing a heart attack. Another problem is, like I mentioned before, the publication bias, the problem that companies are much more likely to submit a result for publication if it's favorable than if it's negative.
Yes.
And finally, the way you spin a result can make a big difference. As we all know from being a high school student at some point, you can make a graph show whatever you want by adjusting how it looks, and can do a very good job of exaggerating the benefit of something when in fact the benefit is relatively small, and perhaps the risks outweigh those small benefits.
I think you'd agree that the journals nowadays are more sophisticated about their graphing, and they may be less sophisticated about those endpoints that you talk about, and whether in fact a molecule, in addition to lowering cholesterol, gives somebody a better quality of life. Those are the kinds of things that seem to be at play here, and for journalists to be aware of those issues, I think one of the things your article talks about is the awareness of editors, and in interviewing the editors, I thought was a diabolical twist. Whose idea was it to interview the editors?
Well, I think our motivation for interviewing the editors was to sort of get a sense of whether or not editors think that this is an important problem. We suspected, based on our preliminary results, that news articles didn't do a very good job of disclosing funding sources, or didn't do a very good job of using brand names or of using generic names. But the question we had is, why is this the case? And the possibilities are, one, that the editors don't think that this is a problem, or two, that they're trying to do the right thing but fail to do it for whatever reason. And I think our survey showed that it's the latter possibility, that they know that this is a problem and that they should be indicating how a study has been funded. And I think most also agreed that they should generally try to use the generic names, but they were running into obstacles, and there's all sorts of reasons for this. It's hard to determine sometimes whether or not a study has received company funding. This information is often buried in the methods section or at the end of an article, and it's very hard to fish through it to find this information. I think that medical journals need to help journalists by placing this information very prominently, ideally even in the abstract of an article, so that everyone can easily pick this information out, and additionally include it in press releases.
Well, one of the things that I noticed in the article is that you said that some of these articles make for dense reading, and that journalists will often miss, for instance, the funding of a study, and you seem to give them a sort of license to not struggle with it. And Are you certain that you want anyone who is incapable of reading a medical article reporting on the medical research?
Yeah, I think you raise a good point.
Which is not to say that everyone reporting on medical articles should be a physician or have clinical experience.
Right. Reading a medical study critically is very, very hard, and to really do it well, you need a lot of training in study methods and epidemiology. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of practicing clinicians, myself included in this, are not experts in reading medical literature. And we really need to rely on the medical journals to sift through and really identify the flaws. And we also need to talk to independent experts to identify these flaws. So while it's great if journalists are able to become familiar with some basic epidemiology principles and identify major flaws in studies, I think it would be very difficult to expect journalists to read a study as carefully and as well as an expert. And for this reason, I think it's really important to talk to independent experts and not just rely on determining the flaws in the study themselves.
Well, this is interesting research, Mike. Are you going to? I know that you've written a couple of op-ed pieces for the Boston Globe about this general topic. Are you going to be pursuing this line of research?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting how news media can influence readers' perceptions about issues, and I think this is very important in medicine. And I think we have a lot of previous research that others have done showing that the news media tends to give overly favorable impressions of new medical developments and tends to underemphasize the risks. And I think from a public health standpoint, right now in this country, we have a problem of doctors treating patients too aggressively and sort of being swept away and doing the latest and greatest when the data really doesn't yet support that. And in fact, some of these latest and greatest technologies may actually be harmful at times. So we need to do a better job as doctors of really picking out the appropriate interventions. And I think one important way to do this is to prevent the overly enthusiastic promotion of new developments before they've really been tested, and the media has an important role in doing this.
Do you have another piece of research on the desk now that you're working on?
Well, I think the next thing that we're going to look at, and I don't know yet if anything is going to come from it, is whether the amount of advertising that both medical journals and newspapers get from pharmaceutical companies influences their reporting patterns. So are medical journals that receive a lot of pharmaceutical company funding more likely to report favorable industry-sponsored studies? Are newspapers that receive a lot of industry advertising more likely to cover favorable industry-sponsored studies. It's hard to know what's actually going to come out of this, but that's the next thing that we're going to look into. Hopefully, nothing will, but we'd like to just check it out.
We'll follow it as you proceed, Mike. And I want to thank you again for your time, Dr. Michael Hochman.
Thank you very much.
Finally, this week, speaking of the news, it's been an unusually slow week for medical news. But that's okay. It just means less material for you to absorb. If you find yourself with spare time as a result, have a look at the journal Science, which has just published the winners of its annual contest centered around, what else? Scientific illustration. The winners include imaginings about everything from the origins of RNA polymerization to visualizing the way the books of the Bible cite each other. It's worth a look. As always, if you'd like to talk about any of this or anything else, call 617-440-4374. Just leave your name and number so I can get back to you and get your permission to put your comments on the podcast. Links for all stories are available at podcasts.jwatch.org. Join us next week, won't you? Thank you for listening. For the Journal Watch podcast, I'm Joe Elia.